I wonder your thoughts as you look at these two world leaders today in the same room, knowing how much difficulty they've experienced in their relationship since October 7th. Joe Biden made it pretty clear last night in his address to the nation that a ceasefire in Gaza is his priority. That's the number one thing he wants to accomplish by the time he leaves office. Will this meeting today help?
Yeah, he had a tall order in his final speech, President Biden, about the list of accomplishments he'd like to achieve in his last 6 months. I certainly hope he achieves all of them, including an end to the war. And I do think that we're going to reach some kind of end. That doesn't mean, of course, that you're not going to see probably additional raids or efforts to target and kill Hamas leaders, but some kind of end to the intense violence and strikes that we are continuing to see. And there has been, and I have said this now over the last month, this building pressure to reach that end. And apparently Netanyahu and Biden spoke about it today, how to reach that end. And it's the same deal that's on the table, the three-phase proposal that the Biden administration has proposed, and the pressure all around to agree to that deal and to agree to the details of that deal is growing. So I do think that the meeting today certainly helped. I will say that as controversial as Netanyahu's visit to Washington has been and his address to Congress, I will say it is poignant for other reasons to see the way he talks about President Biden and Biden's 40 years of friendship to Israel. That is very true. That has been a key feature of Biden's policies, and he has always felt strongly about Israel. And I think that Netanyahu was right in not playing on political divisions while he's here, at least not yet, and really expressing gratitude to the president in his address yesterday and today in his meeting.
Yeah, of course, he did express gratitude for Donald Trump as well. In his address, he's going to be heading to Mar-a-Lago tomorrow to meet with the former president, Hagar. But just to focus on the role of President Biden a moment longer, they, of course, after their Oval Office meeting, met with families of hostages. And they were asked, those families, during a meeting with the press, if Biden dropping out of the race affected a hostage deal. One of them said, I actually think it allows the president to be laser focused on the things that are true priorities for him. They went on to suggest not worrying about all the things surrounding a re-election allows him to focus on this. What do you think about the fact that we now know Joe Biden is going to be a one-term president? He is out of there in January of 2025. How does that change the character of this entire thing?
Well, it's true. I mean, I was there for the second term, both under President Bush and President Obama. And often at the end of a term of any president, when they know that it's the end, they'll often look to achieve a number of big goals that they feel they can just push through. And so I do expect President Biden actually to have this kind of renewed effort to achieve a lot of the goals that he had on his list. Like I said, it was a tall order: curing cancer, ending climate change, making more progress on gun control. However, he does have, obviously, he's the president of the United States. There's a lot of power there. And if he's not worried about an election, then there's a lot there that he can go and pursue. And I think that Vice President Harris has separated herself already enough where I think he can pursue these efforts without worrying that she's going to get blamed for. I mean, the Republicans will try that, but I do think that the chief stands alone in this case. But I will say, so I do think that it'll be interesting for that for those reasons. I do have to say on the hostage point, because I want to highlight that a lot of people have been frustrated. Hostage families, a lot of Americans in general, Jewish Americans, have been frustrated at the lack of priority, at what they deem a lack of priority from the Biden administration on the hostages, particularly the American hostages. There are still American hostages being held in Gaza, and unlike other hostages or wrongfully detained individuals you hear about around the world, we have not heard a lot, at least not forcefully and repeatedly, about the American hostages. And so I do hope that we're going to see more of that in the coming months.
Hagar, does Netanyahu threaten to undo any progress done today when he visits Mar-a-Lago tomorrow?
I don't think so. If anything, I think that the meeting, the address to Congress, is what could have undone a lot of progress. And we don't have exactly a good track record with Netanyahu addressing Congress back in 2015 when I was in the U.S. government, and Speaker Boehner invited him to speak to address Congress behind President Obama's back to speak about the nuclear deal, and that was not looked upon very favorably. I understand this time it was a bit different, but still controversial nonetheless. And Vice President Harris didn't even preside over the talk, right? So you could have had that, and he could have used that opportunity, and I expected him to try and play more on the divisions and stress to Congress that he needed their help over the president's, which he tried to do in a video only a few weeks ago, where he went out and tried to blame the Biden administration for weapons shipments holdups and a holdup of weapons shipments and so on. And he didn't play into any of that. He made it more of a stump speech. I'm not trying to say that it was a great speech at all, but he didn't go into that. So I don't expect much that would be controversial out of the Trump meeting. I expect the typical. I expect him to have a PR show, to have a photo op, to play it up. But I do think he'll be careful, especially given how much more tight the election seems to be now. I think he'll be much more careful to come off as though he's endorsing Trump, given that you now have Vice President Harris in the race and polls are showing a much tighter one.
Well, as we think about what Netanyahu said yesterday, Hagar, he also talked about the idea that Israel is standing in the way of Iran in the Middle East, and it's Israel that's making sure that U.S. troops don't have to be put on the ground. He talked about how Israel will essentially go after anyone that threatens it, and that includes, as he referenced, Hezbollah and the border to the north. Part of what President Biden said yesterday was not just that he wants to see an end to the war in Gaza, but peace and security in the Middle East. Maybe he could get the one. Can he get the other?
Yes, I think, again, God bless him for trying to get to peace in the Middle East. I think every U.S. president has dreamt of that, because that would surely secure an amazing legacy. I think that even with just reaching a ceasefire would be still an amazing legacy, to be honest with you. But I think that's too tall of an order. But you harp on a very good point, because Bibi, in his address to Congress, tried to make this point to everybody that basically Israel's fight is the U.S. fight, and whatever Israel is doing is also on behalf of the United States, not just on behalf of Israel. And he's harping on this at a time when we do have significant threats that we're seeing from Iran, and they're not just toward Israel, they're toward U.S. presence as well. And we are seeing, and this is something that I think that is really should not go unmentioned. When you saw that Houthi strike that happened a week ago, where a drone went and exploded over a building in Tel Aviv, killing one Israeli citizen, that drone came in. It was surveilled, apparently, but a, quote, human error is what prevented it from being shot down. And the Israeli military is still investigating that. But I want to highlight that as a former counterterrorism person and how big of a deal that is to have a terrorist group and militants who are thousands of miles away send a drone and have it be able to reach the capital and cause any kind of damage. It is a very different world of warfare when fighting terrorist groups. And so I think it's impossible to reach peace across the Middle East, but I do think that Netanyahu is right in saying that he needs to focus on all of them, and that it impacts the United States' national security as well.